it drill. I'm independent, I don't need no deal. I'm jaws on the beat, I got flow that kills. Do my thing with a few G's, Lauryn Hill.
So in this video, I'm going to try and explain to you what an EQ is, and probably going to alter the way you think about an EQ. Essentially, what an EQ does, it allows a change of amplitude at frequency. The way to think of this is, think of your mixing desk, and we've just got the Logic mixer up here on this very simple mix. And at each point, we've got a fader, and that fader, that can adjust amplitude, so level of that particular element of the sound. So if we play this track back.
Trying to talk the talk, better back it bro, or else you better back down. Quit if you don't stack pounds, I'm just speaking facts now. Assess what you chat about, all these trappers going ham. Got you fam, dry snitched on yourself, now the feds they wanna pat you down, it's fuckery. Still repping the West Country, trying to talk the talk.
We can see the different levels of the different parts of the audio, and if we solo this second one here, which is the main vocal, we only hear the main vocal.
Trying to talk the talk, better back it bro, or else you better.
Now if we adjust that fader, we adjust the amplitude of that particular piece of audio.
Trying to talk the talk, better back it bro, or else you better back down. Quit if you don't stack pounds, I'm just speaking.
And we can do that in context with all of the other parts of the audio.
Trying to talk the talk, better back it bro, or else you better back down. Quit if you don't stack pounds. Facts now, assess what you chat about. All these trappers going ham, chatting about I got you fam.
Well, what EQ really does is the same thing, but just across the one singular sound instead, or across a collection of sound. For example, if we place an EQ just on the main vocal here, we can think of these points much like the faders on a mix channel, but instead of controlling the amplitude of a whole sound, they just control one small part of that specific sound. It's exactly the same principle, and on many EQs, once we have a node selected, so for example, we'll select this like light green colored one here, we're actually adjusting it in amplitude much the same as we would be on a mixer. Obviously, we've got these slopes either side, and we'll dive more into those. That's all that's really happening. It's changing the amplitude of a part of a sound rather than how a mixer affects the sounds that are sent to it. It's the same principle. Now what this means for us is that we can adjust the amplitude or level of specific parts of a sound, perhaps something that's too loud or too quiet, to adjust our overall balance. For example, let's take this vocal.
Trying to talk the talk, better back it bro, or else you better back down. Quit if you don't stack pounds, I'm just.
There's a lot of weight in his vocal, around the 300, 200 kind of range. This could work really well, but it might be too strong, and we would lose some of the high end, because when we bring it up in the mix, we're just going to get this area really focused on here, because it's going to be the loudest part.
Trying to talk the talk, better back it bro, or else you better back down. Quit if you don't stack pounds, I'm just speaking facts now. Assess what you chat about, all these trappers going.
Well, what we could do with an EQ is we could control the amplitude of this area by bringing it down, say, 2 decibels.
Trying to talk the talk, better back it bro, or else you better back down. Quit if you don't stack pounds, I'm just speaking facts now. Assess what you chat about, all these trappers going ham, chatting about I got you fam. Dry snitched on yourself, now the feds they wanna pat you down, it's fuckery. Still repping the West Country, trying to talk the talk, better back it bro, or else you better back down.
Alternatively, we can also boost with our EQ, and perhaps the 2 to 3K range here could use a slight lift in conjunction with the slight cut here, just to help flatten out all of it. And now this is the same kind of difference as bringing our kick drum down and our hi-hats up slightly on our faders, but we're just applying it across one sound.
Trying to talk the talk, better back it bro, or else you better back down. Quit if you don't stack pounds, I'm just speaking facts now. Assess what you chat about, all these trappers going ham, chatting about I got you fam.
So I hope that helps you understand what an EQ does. As we move on, we'll understand a lot more of the functions we've just looked at here, but this is the primary thing that an EQ lets us do: adjust amplitude at frequency points. In this video, we're going to go over the common parameters that you would find on most EQs. In this instance, I'm using Logic's stock channel EQ. Some EQs and some DAWs will come with extra features or things that seem slightly different, but as a general rule, the Logic EQ here has the main features that you'll find on most modern DAW EQs. So to start off, we have 3 different filter types. We have cutoff filters, and they can be seen here at the upmost left and right in Logic. And if we bring the frequency down, we can see what these filters do in a good visual representation here. And we can see why they're called cutoff filters. Any frequency above or below their cutoff point is cut away to 0 dB, so completely removed, dependent on the slope of the cutoff filter. And the slope of the cutoff filter in the case of Logic is represented here by the 24 dB per octave. Now, there are some really common slopes of cutoff filters. They are 6, 12, 18, 24, and you will see some others as well. So Logic supports 6, 12, 18, 24, 36, and 48 are more extreme. You'll very, very rarely see things like 36, 48 used, but they do have a purpose in certain situations. On analog emulation EQ, you will not really find these. They're very hard to create in the analog domain, if nigh on impossible to do them cleanly and well. The second filter type we have is called a shelf, and we can see them here. They're the second most in on the left and right on Logic. What a shelf does is kind of the opposite really of the cutoff filter. It allows us to boost or cut continuously from its cutoff point. So here, the frequency it's working at is 87 Hertz. We've reduced by 5.2 dB, and from that cutoff point, it continuously reduces by 5.2 dB after its initial slope. Now, unlike a cutoff filter, we don't have a slope of, say, 24 dB per octave. We instead have a Q, and our Q parameter determines that slope. We can decide whether it takes a lot longer or it happens quite quickly to get to its maximum reduction point. Notice the faster it happens, we tend to get a boost before the cutoff starts to happen, and our actual reduction frequency goes a little bit further back than the initial reason. Now, there's lots of technical reasons for this, but our actual cutoff frequency here, we've already started to have some reduction. If we go the other way with it, we actually start to get a reduction much, much further back, almost as far as 1 kilohertz here, even though we initially want our cutoff point to not happen until 87 Hertz. Generally, the more subtle the curve and the slope, the more natural sounding the EQ, and we'll explore that as we go. Our third filter type is known as the Bell EQ, and these are the most common that you would likely have seen and perhaps used. When we boost, we get kind of this wide spike, we get kind of this wide hilly slope, and when we cut down, we'll get something a little bit more narrow. It tends to point down a little bit. That's due to something called a Q couple. When we boost a Bell EQ, it sounds more natural to have a big wide slope like this. However, when we cut, we can use a much more narrow Q, and we're less likely to hear that because we're generally removing specific frequencies, whereas if we boost them, our ears tend to latch onto them. A bell can generally move across the full frequency spectrum. It will tend to slope oddly depending on the EQ at the most extremes. You can see that happen. And these are used for boosting key frequencies and cutting harsher frequencies. Q, again, adjusts the slopes, but this time either side of our boost or cut point. A high Q gives us a narrow EQ curve, whereas a lower Q value gives us those big sweeping hills and dips. And those are the 3 main filter types you're going to find across pretty much every stock EQ. There are a couple of others that we're going to explore in the intermediate section, but for now, those are your bread and butter for what you're going to need for 85 to 90% of all of your EQ needs. Okay, so in this video, I'm just going to explain a technique that you'll see me use a lot, which is quite simply boost and sweep. And I just use it to help frequencies and things stand out so I can pick them out really easily, whether they're pleasant or unpleasant. So I've just got Pro Q up on the screen here. It's on a vocal bus for this track. And I'm just going to show you the technique. So I'm going to take this one here and we'll get rid of him. And what we'll do, we just click to add a point. And what we do here is we're just going to boost up a point on a Bell EQ And most of the time, we're going to have quite a narrow spectrum like that. And we're just going to use the frequency control here and just scroll through and sweep through. So this is on the vocals, so we can solo out.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started to drown.
What I'm doing, I'm just listening for bits that sound unpleasant or sound more pleasant or resonate.
You heard.
So for example, in here, there's a couple of phrases that pop out.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started to drown.
So I'd just note that up here is probably going to need some corrective EQ.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started to drown. Hearts are empty, but now I'm ready to. You heard me while I.
Now here, for example, this boost, there's a couple of frequencies this really helps bring out that actually enhance the vocal. So we'll just take note that in there, we could maybe do with a bit of a lift and some corrective EQ there to help the body of the vocal come up a bit more.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started to drown. Hearts are empty, but now I'm ready to. You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started to drown. Hearts are empty, but now I'm ready to. You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started to drown. Hearts are empty, but now I'm ready to. You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time.
And just here, I can hear the tiniest bit of resonance. This vocal is actually really nicely recorded, but something like that, or just maybe note that that's there, really narrow cue and potentially cut it away. But we're just listening for things that really stick out and stand out. The other thing is the low end. So we'll tend to go with a bit of a wider cue there. On Pro Q, I like using it because I can just click here and roll my finger. Same with actually with the Logic channel EQ. And I want to hear if anything in the low end is doing anything useful.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time.
And here we can hear, even though we're boosting it, we're not getting any benefit to the vocal. There's nothing really of use down here.
You heard me while.
Nothing really useful until the fundamentals around here.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time.
So a really great exercise for you is to find an element in your track that you're currently working on and use the EQ, whether it's a channel EQ, Pro Q, whatever you have access to, and simply do this. Make sure you turn the analyzer off as part of the exercise. So we just switch it off entirely here. Give it a boost, fairly narrow, and just have a sweep through and try and listen for any areas that are standing out.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started to drown.
Try it with a wider and narrow cue as well.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time.
A wider cue can really help you find out places that will benefit from a boost later.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started to drown. Hearts are empty, but now I'm ready to. You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started to drown. Hearts are.
So very roughly, we'll probably end up with something like that.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started to drown. Hearts are. You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started to drown.
Yeah, and that's definitely helped. So that's just that boost and sweep technique that I use to help find areas that are causing problems, could benefit from attention and boosts as well. And yeah, just sweep through sounds, have a listen, and great to turn the analyzer off so you can't see those peaks and just do it with your ears. It's a really good exercise. So I'd like you to try that before moving on to the next section. So in this example, I want to show you a really common use for using the HPF, or the high pass filter, to remove unwanted low end that's going to affect another part of your mix. So the EQ that we've got up here is placed on a lead sound that's made with a synth in this particular mix.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started to.
And it's got a high pass filter on it, and we can see everything here from the 102 Hertz region is rolled off. Now, the reason it's 102 Hertz, there's a section later in the track where the peaks that you could see here, those fundamentals, go a little bit lower. So I didn't want to take those out, but I did want to make sure that none of this low end that was unnecessary was there. So if I switch off the analyzer and we'll take the shelf off, we can see that there's going to be a lot of unwanted low end in here. Look. All of that's going to be where we want our kick drum to be, where we want our bass tones to be, and it serves no purpose in the sound itself. If we were to just put a low pass on and bring everything down here, there's no tonality, it's just purely sub-weight noise. And it's more than likely that you can't even hear it. So we're taking nothing audibly pleasant away, but it would impact other elements of our mix. So that is why we would use this particular filter type to take all of that away. And we can now see that it does that and it rolls off. Now you'd be tempted to apply this to just about everything other than your kick and bass. Some people will advise that. Generally, I think you need to really listen, as some sounds really do benefit from having that low end in there. So you can try the technique that I just showed of doing this and having a listen to what's really down there. But the other thing is very simply just practice your A and B, so on and off, and engage it in context and see if something's being taken away from the sound in the mix, then you're likely cutting frequency that's going to be something that you'd want to keep in your overall track. But in this instance, this is the most common use. We're just tidying up and making sure that there's not unwanted sound that we wouldn't necessarily hear, and we're definitely not going to miss, that would affect other elements of our track. In this video, I'm going to show you a really simple tip to help you get better results with your mixing. So for example, let's say we are doing this mix and we're maybe struggling with the main body of the vocal. We're struggling to find out what's in the way of it, what the balance is. And our temptation would be to go to the vocal and boost up that area. It makes a lot more sense actually to reduce the amplitude around the other conflicting area and leaving what we want remaining on top, because the balance probably already sounds good if we've dialed in what we're after. So many EQs have a solo feature. So what I will generally do is put the EQ on the master bus like this. Now the stock EQ in Logic doesn't allow me to do this. What I would do instead is just get two filters either side here, give them both something like a 24 dB slope, and I'm going to bring them down to this area here. This way I can hear just what's going on in this area. So I can now tell that I've got some of my kick, the body of the vocal, the snare fundamental, and the low end of the piano and bass. So now I know what's in that area and what's perhaps muffling the vocal. I can go in and find those particular things in those areas. Equally, I can tell that this isn't the main area of the vocal that's struggling. We can hear it's still quite muffled, so we can maybe adjust our focus slightly. This is actually a lot more of the area we want to focus. We can now hear top end of the snare and the piano melody, but some of the bass, that's likely going to be our problem, probably around the 500 Hz. So we drag this back. And now we can hear that bit of bass fighting with the vocal. Perhaps you're not using Logic and you've got a different EQ, or perhaps you've got a tool like EQ2 or EQ3. I have EQ3 as well, but I still use EQ2 a lot. It's just very, very simple. What this does, I can put any point anywhere, and I have the headphone icon here, and this will isolate a band for me. I can use the mouse wheel just to adjust the cue. So I can use this to do exactly the same thing, but really easily on the fly. Check this out. And I use this just to listen to really specific areas when I'm struggling to find things that are fighting in a mix. It's just a little tip I thought I would show you. If you've got something like Pro Q2, really quick and easy to do, but with the channel EQ, just putting the filters on either side, another way to do it. I really hope that helps you improving your mixes and understanding better where balances and things are. You know, it would have been very difficult to figure out, oh, it was kind of the mid-range of the bass that was causing a problem there. In this video, I'm going to explain a very simple exercise, and it is the A/B test for EQ. EQing the vocal bus here, I've arrived at a very unusual, but a very simple EQ solution. We're taking away the low end because there was nothing down here we needed. I've put this step down here. It's basically a shelf because we've got a resonant frequency in our voice that stands out a lot more than all of the others. We can see it in the analyzer.
For the darkness to leave in a whisper. Bring my love back.
Now I've just used this to balance that out. Now I've arrived at the amount of being, I don't know, what does it go? 2.09 by a very simple A/B test, and something else is closing my eyes. The A/B test, first off, in isolation, I'm going to listen to the sound and make sure it sounds okay. Now this vocal is purposely distorted and sounds a bit off because it fits well in the mix. I get that, it sounds a little bit strange, but it works in context of the whole track. Listen. However, in isolation, it sounds pretty rough.
Heart is on my sleeve, love is cold down in winter, frozen to the core.
The A/B test is simple. I've arrived at this kind of calculation. I'm going to have the EQ off. I'm going to make a pretty short loop that I can listen through. Just as it's about to loop through, I'm going to put the EQ back on. And does the second take sound better or worse? If it sounds better, we're in the right ballpark. Simple as that.
Heart is on my sleeve, love is cold down in winter, frozen to the core, thoughts of you, there's a linger. Longings on my sleeve, love is cold down in winter, frozen to the core, thoughts of you, there's a linger. Heart is on my sleeve, love is cold down in winter, frozen to the core, thoughts of you, there's a linger. Heart is on my sleeve, love is cold down in winter.
Now, you're probably thinking, well, I can't really hear a difference. You know, that's fine. It's a really subtle difference of just pulling down that key fundamental, which is right in the body of the vocal. However, we need to listen to this in context and A/B it as well. So instead of just having the vocal soloed, listen to it in context of the track, and you'll hopefully be able to hear now that the body of the vocal poked through too much, and just bringing it back 2 dB was enough just to have it sit a little bit better. I hope you'll agree with me.
Heart is on my sleeve, love is cold down in winter, frozen to the core, thoughts of you, there's a linger. Heart is on my sleeve, love is cold down in winter, frozen to the core, thoughts of you, there's a linger. Heart is on my sleeve, love is cold down in winter, frozen to the core, thoughts of you, there's a linger. Heart is on my sleeve, love is cold down in winter, frozen to the core, thoughts of you, there's a linger.
Now, if you're still struggling to hear that, the way that I arrive at these particular levels and that point was very simple. There's 2 exercises that I'll do. I'll either close my eyes, and if I'm using something like Pro Q, I can just select a point and just use up and down on the magic mouse. to adjust levels in Q, so I don't need to be able to see it, or I'll stare at an object that does not move, like my MIDI keyboard. If we're staring at something and we've got the analyzer up and we can see all the bright colors and our door moving across, we're not purely focused on what's going on. Now, let's try the same exercise we just did, but I'm going to force you to close your eyes by turning the screen off.
Bodies on my sleeve, love is cold out of winter, frozen to the core, that's a view, there's a linger. Bodies on my sleeve, love is cold out of winter, frozen to the core, that's a view, there's a linger. Bodies on my sleeve, love is cold out of winter, frozen to the core, that's a view, there's a linger. Bodies on my sleeve, love is cold out of winter, frozen to the core, that's a view, there's a linger.
Now, I'm not going to tell you what order I did that in, but hopefully, because you were not looking at anything and you were just focused on the sound, it was far more obvious to you what was going on. And if that was the case, then perfect, my point has landed. It's a really simple exercise. Close your eyes or stare at nothingness and just listen to what you're doing. When you've got issues and you can't figure out what to do, that's when you use your analyzers and tools and visualize exactly where that frequency is. But for the most part, close your eyes, listen. Does it sound better on an A/B test? Really simple exercise when EQing. This particular layout for an EQ is a Pultec. In this case, this is the UAD Pultec, authorized emulation, but you'll see other versions that are laid out similar to this, and it's important that we understand why they're laid out like this and how they work, because they're slightly different to the parametric EQs that you'll see. So the switches we have here are actually set frequency points. So we have 200 through to 1000. As we can see, just above is listed peak, and this is going to be a peak decibel control. We can only go upwards. We can only boost with this section of the EQ. So this is on the piano here. And if we place it at 1000, this is a wide boost at 1000. Now, you'll notice it starts to saturate and distort, and that's the real nature and sound of these types of EQs. It's a lot of the character that we go for. Now, what I've actually done on the piano is I've got it at 3K here on the right-hand side and maximum amount of peak. So if we disable it with the switch just here, this is how it actually sounds. This is what I did to it in the mix. Remember, we were talking about that high frequency. Well, this is really what I'm lifting up here to give loads of air to the sound and just help this piano stick out in the mix.
Feeling heavy, but now I'm steady, going up and hitting the ground. Feeling heavy, but now I'm steady, going up and hitting the ground. Feeling heavy.
And hopefully you can hear that, how it just lifts up the piano. Because I'm pushing it so much here, it distorts, adds extra harmonics, and just gives it that bit of character.
Feeling heavy.
Now, if we want to cut with these EQs, we have to use the dip sections. And again, we have to set the frequency and we push the dip. But remember, this is now actually going to be taking away. One of the useful things about this, like we looked originally at our filter types, where a bell curve upwards was nice and curved, and when we pulled it down, it was more of a point. The same thing applies here. So we can actually put this at the same frequency. So I could put this at 3K, and the dip is going to cut at the 3K frequency point, but it's also going to leave a boost as well, either side of it, because of it being a much wider boost and a narrow cut. It can give a really unique effect. So let's listen to it in isolation. So they don't just cancel each other out. And I'll often use a blend of the two together like this to get a particular sound. It is a common technique used with this type of EQ. Now, there's another form of the Pultec that you might see, and it looks like this. We've got a similar principle, apart from here, the CPS Okay, we've got both attenuate and boost linked over to here. And for the high frequency, the KCS here, boost is linked to this. However, attenuation is actually linked over here. And then we've got a bandwidth, so we can actually narrow those bands or widen them up, but it applies to all of the bands on here. So that's a quick overlook of Pultec EQs and just a technique that I like to use with the boost and cut at the same frequency point. And generally I'm going to use them to lift up, add loads of high end and potentially distort sounds, add a little bit of saturation like you heard with the piano, just to help it pop out in the mix there. Okay, in this video, we're going to look at how you would approach correcting a vocal. Now, the vocal part I'm going to use is just this here.
You heard me while I gave you
And to help you out, I'm going to take the reverb off. Now, the EQ that I actually applied in the final version was a Pultec with a bit of a boost and cutting away some low end with a different EQ because the Pultec can't do that. However, what we're going to do, we're going to switch those off. I'm going to leave my other processing and I'll put in the basic Logic EQ. That way, pretty much any stock EQ you're going to use, you'll be able to do the same job. And I'll show you how I would sort of come to those results and process I would go through. So the first thing we're going to do is listen to the vocal itself in isolation. And I'm going to take a band, usually from the higher frequency, and just kind of boost and have a quick listen sweep through with quite a wide band like this.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started to drown. Hearts are empty, but now I'm ready to you heard.
Okay, and what I'm listening for here are areas that when they're overly boosted, the vocal maybe sounds more present or nicer, or if it's too boosted, it in fact sounds a little bit harsh or muddy. So for example, up here in the high end, when this is boosted,
you heard me while I gave you plenty of.
Right around here, the 8 and 6K, there's some pretty harsh frequencies that pop through. Now we're doing an extreme boost, but we now know that they're there. A boost around here between 1 and 2K, so the 1.5 region, actually sounded really nice.
You heard me while I gave you plenty.
And then around the 500 was a bit too much, it becomes boxy.
You heard me while.
I've also had a quick look at the analyzer and I've seen there's lots of low end, but there's no real fundamentals beyond the 100. So I know I'm probably not going to need anything that's down there, but we will need to have a listen to this area and see if this is worthwhile. So the first thing I'm going to look to do is address any areas that are potentially harsh. So we found that sort of 6 to 8K region where it was a little bit harsh at times. We're going to boost that and now we're going to narrow it down.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of.
And you can hear it there, and we found it quite well. So we're going to narrow it off even more and let it play again.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of.
All we're going to do is bring that down now and just know that that's going to be controlled. And we're only going to take it out a couple of dB. So when we play it,
you heard me while I gave you plenty of.
It's just a little bit harsher. We'll just keep taking it out and out until it sounds right.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of.
It's just going to balance it out. We're going to really focus on this. You'll hear it every time now. So what we need to do is also listen to it in context of the track.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and.
There you go. And as long as it's not coming out as being too harsh in the track and it sits right, we know we've made an improvement, and we would A/B it as well. Now, if something like this becomes persistent, I would look at using dynamic EQ, and we'll cover that in the advanced sections of EQ as well. Next thing I would look to address is this low end here. So I want to have a listen to what's going on here. Now, there's a couple of ways I can do it. I could grab a point and boost up these, what look to be sort of fundamental frequencies that are going on.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started to drown. Hearts are empty.
So we can hear that this is really the body of the vocal.
You heard me while I gave you plenty
However,
of
this here,
love and time, but I started to drown. Hearts are empty.
it's really not any use to us. There's nothing great going on. So we actually know that sort of 200 is the lowest this goes.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started.
So we can probably put a high pass filter in and take it all the way up to something like 180. And we'll give it a slope a little bit harsher than that. We don't need all of this weighty low end coming in. So we'll put it on an 18 dB slope, and we'll change it so the Q gives us just the littlest bump here before it goes out. So we're just going to have a tiny little bump here on our fundamentals, and then it's just going to fade out nice and quickly and get rid of all this unwanted low end that we just don't need.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started.
Okay, so it sounds nice in isolation. Now the other thing, when we were sweeping through, it sounded nice at about 1.5k with a boost. So let's do that, and we're going to boost it up really, really loud, and when it's too much, then we're going to bring it back.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started to drown.
And for me, it settles about there. So nearly a 4 dB boost, but I went way too far and then pulled it back till it sounded nice. As it was sounding nice, I pulled it back just a little bit further, knowing that that's probably going to be about right. So let's just give you some context. Let's have it switched off, listen through, switch it on, see if the vocal sounds nicer just with the EQ. And remember, we don't listen in isolation. It matters in the mix. So we got to check it in context as well.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started to drown. Hearts are empty, but now I'm ready to. You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started to drown. Hearts are empty, but now I'm ready to. You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started to drown. Hearts are empty, and now I'm ready to. You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started to drown.
Cool, and I can hear the vocal does sound a lot nicer, but I've taken this too far, and this definitely needs to dial back, probably by as much as half of what we did. So we bring it back down to 2 dB or so.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started to drown.
Okay, now I like to keep my vocals pretty natural in terms of EQ and not go too hard. However, depending on your situation, like I'm lucky here, this vocal is really, really nice. You might have frequencies that pop out and things like that. So how would you deal with that? Well, let's take another band that we haven't used, green one here, and we're going to go quite narrow, and we're going to look for things that are poking through. So this 800 does stick through a little bit. Let's exaggerate that, and we'll solo it for context.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started to drown.
So hopefully you can hear what that's doing. This really exaggerate it. You get like this horrible boxy tone. And sometimes this will happen when a vocal gets recorded and it won't get picked up.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started to drown.
Okay, so if you hear that, the way to find it is to look kind of for those spikes. You are going to use an analyzer here. If you don't have an analyzer, make a peak like this and sweep it along. Don't be so harsh or it can make anything sound like this. So you want to dial it back a bit. And you're going to try and find where those peaks are. 400 through to 800 is usually a good region to check if you're having this issue.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started to drown. Hearts are empty, but now I'm ready to. You heard me while I.
There you go. So that's not the particularly nicest frequency. And what we'd do is have a nice narrow spike like that. Maybe narrow it off even more. We're literally just going to dip it away. We want it to be transparent. We don't want to put this huge spike in necessarily. We want to be kind of subtle, like 6 dBs, probably as far as I'd ever want to cut something away like this. If it's beyond that kind of EQ treatment, you're going to be struggling, but something like that.
You heard me while I gave you plenty of love and time, but I started to drown.
And even this vocal, it benefits a little bit from that being cut away because it wasn't a particularly nice frequency. Notice as well, it only happens at particular notes. So if you find there's a particular note that's being played and you're hearing that, find out if it's going to be part of the harmonic series of that particular note, and you can EQ it away that way. But that's how I would approach getting a vocal done. And yeah, as you can see in the final track, it's pretty much the same thing, just done with 2 different EQs, and we got a good result.
You hurt